The culture of peace. We're going to start with definitions. It's a term widely used, of course. Society-wide practices that and habits. Society-wide practices and habits that promote peace. It's a positive way of viewing peace as much more than a mere absence of war. All forms of violence violate peace, but rather than merely opposing violence, the culture of peace is affirmative. But more specifically, the United Nations has officially declared our current decade the International Decade for a Culture of Peace. Therefore, we have not only widespread ideas on the topic, but official documents to which many people in the international community have devoted much thought. This includes a pledge that to date has been signed by over 75 million people worldwide. The first of 6 things which are pledged to are respect the life and dignity of each human being without discrimination and prejudice. And the second one is practice active nonviolence, rejecting violence in all its forms, in particular toward the most deprived and vulnerable, such as children and adolescents. Now, the logic of these two being the first parts of a nonviolence pledge makes sense. They're foundational to peace. Okay? They're also the starting points of the concept of a culture of life. Again, the term culture of life is broadly used in a variety of ways to promote the protection of individual human lives. But it has an official usage that especially was promoted by John Paul II. It has become common in Catholic groups, especially conservative ones, and has expanded to non-Catholic conservative groups and politicians. Its use is much more widespread than that, but in the polarizing presentation offered by groups such as the media, the culture of peace has been seen as left-wing, and the culture of life has been seen as right-wing. And both are propaganda terms for that reason, that it's really intended to be a term that covers a packet of ideas in a partisan way. I was told by a Catholic friend that in his diocese, the Peace and Justice Office and the Respect Life Office are full of people that don't get along with each other. I was just sitting there going, how ironic. But despite the foundational principles being similar, there are arguments about over which politicians to support, and stands on unrelated issues tend to be taken by one group and not another, such as the status of homosexuality or how the schools ought to be run. And these all being part of packets that make people see themselves as more polarized into different camps. Now, culture of peace adherents, we're still on definitions, are likely to oppose not only war, but such things as riots, lynchings, hate crimes, dictatorships, the structural violence of poverty, and capital punishment. Now, as defined by Pope John Paul II, the culture of life issues include opposition to abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and capital punishment. Many conservative politicians don't include the death penalty, but the Pope did, and inasmuch as anything can be official, he did include that. From the point of view of peace issues, the death penalty is a use of weapons against an enemy, differing from war only in individually targeting those who probably committed criminal homicide. From the point of view of life issues, the death penalty is euthanasia for the guilty, another example of trying to solve problems by killing individuals. The difference in view is, in practical terms, interchangeable and certainly leads to the same result. With the one position on one issue in common and common foundational principles, the integrating of the culture of peace and the culture of life, face only one obstacle: how embedded they are in the left-wing, right-wing dichotomy. With the stereotypes that each of these wings inflict on each other, and groups like the media inflict on both, this is not a minor point, as I'm sure many of you may have noticed. Now that's definitions. I'm going to discuss some things about the dynamics of violence. Mohandas Gandhi said, quote, "It would seem to me as clear as day that abortion would be a crime." This was based on the point that's critical to the entire opposition to abortion, which is that it is the killing of an unborn child. Biology says so. Practically any small child, when shown a picture of a fetus, will call it a baby. They have not yet gained the sophistication necessary to declare otherwise. But we also know that Gandhi had some puritanical views about sex and sexuality. And of course, a lot of the Catholic and other similar Christian groups do as well. And if abortion bans were sought totally in order to enforce religious views of sexual morality, then of course they would have nothing to do with peace or nonviolence. Now, this points to the importance for abortion opponents in linking the issue to other issues of violence if they wish to make their case. Issues like war, the death penalty, poverty, and racism. And this is precisely, along with euthanasia, the approach called the consistent life ethic. I mean, you may have also heard the seamless garment concept. It's promoted by a group called Consistent Life, which is an international network of over 100 groups that, with a wide variety of religions, a lot of Catholics, but also Buddhists, various forms of Protestants, and of course atheists and agnostics and other secular groups as well. The thesis of abortion as a sexual matter is also countered by groups such as the ProLife Alliance of Gays and Lesbians, which obviously doesn't concur with the anti-homosexuality views. A feminist case against abortion is made by groups such as Feminists for Life of America and the Feminism and Nonviolence Studies Association. And just as there's a group called Republicans for Choice, there's a group called Democrats for Life. Much as the mainstream media adamantly portrays stereotypes, there are many groups that follow a logic that see abortion as violence and therefore is following the dynamics of violence. One of the major features of massive violence, as is commonly understood by peace advocates, is the dehumanization of the potential and actual victims. William Brennan documented this in a book called Dehumanizing the Vulnerable: When Word Games Take Lives. And what he documents is that there's a remarkable congruity of terms that are used for dehumanizing. People are deficient humans, non-humans or non-persons, parasites, diseases, or waste products. I'm not going to give painful examples. He gives an ample supply in his book. But these basic themes go across the various groups: African Americans, Native Americans, Jews, especially under the Nazis, women, people with disabilities, or who live in poverty, have been subjected to these kinds of terms. And I think we're all pretty well familiar with those terms. If we find similar terms being used for unborn children, shouldn't that give us pause? An editorial in the September 1970 issue of California Medicine, the journal, is blunt. They use the term semantic gymnastics as a linguistic strategy for, quote, avoidance of the scientific fact which everyone really knows, that human life begins at conception. Okay. Now, they're in favor of abortion at this point. They recommend what they call the subterfuge of separating abortion from killing because they approve of moving away from a sanctity of life ethic to a quality of life approach to medicine. This approach, as they say, will move from birth selection to death selection. So they're recognizing another of the common dynamics of violence, which is the slippery slope. Once one kind of violence has become acceptable, the obstacles to other forms have been diminished and therefore more likely to occur. So the elderly and people with disabilities could immediately be targeted for hastened death or deliberate medical negligence due to quality of life considerations. And how well would other groups that are traditionally discriminated against, such as racial minorities and women, fare under this idea? In fact, we do know that when people with disabilities or who are terminal are targeted for saying, you know, let's have an argument, let's do pull the plug. Have you noticed how disproportionately this is women? That's true in the cases that don't make the media as well. Now, my own personal experience offers some chilling insight on abortion. I've done over 100 radio interviews and over 20 speaking engagements at colleges as at the time I was president of Feminists for Life. I would start with the premise that everybody knew it was killing and that we were then going to discuss why it is that killing was not a good idea. Only about one time in 5 would anybody call me on this. Would they say, oh, no, I don't buy that premise. I don't think it's killing. I don't accept that the fetus is a human being with rights. Now, I'm thinking, okay, the argument here is not over whether or not it's killing. Most of the time. Every once in a while they do it, and I'd say, thank you for bringing that up, because to my mind it ought to be the whole case. Because, of course, if it's not the killing of a human being, then of course the choice position is the one that makes sense. You could still make arguments about whether there's sexual exploitation that's being facilitated and all this kind of thing, but you deal with that by education. That would be the way of dealing with that. It ought to be the whole case, and yet it was only coming up a minority of the time. Most of the time, people were accepting the premise that it was killing and saying, but it's an acceptable form. That's where the argument is, in large part, in terms of things like radio interviews with call-ins. Now, we can also look at the results of abortion to see how well they resemble the results of violence. If abortion is violence, there should be a large number of women who've had abortions who would join the pro-life movement as they find that they are mothers who are grieving a loss. And in fact, we find that women who have had abortions are a major constituency group of the pro-life movement, have been for years. If abortion is violence, then those who carry them out should show signs of suffering the same kind of psychological symptoms as combat veterans do. In my book, this is The Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress, the Psychological Consequences of Killing. I cover combat veterans in Chapter 2 and in the statistical appendix, where I did a huge study of the Vietnam veterans that the U.S. government had collected. Chapter 6 is on the people who provide abortions. And the answer is we can't really say for sure yet because there hasn't been enough study. But what evidence there is consistent with the idea that they are suffering the same kind of effects that combat veterans do to the act of killing. And if abortion is violence, we will find that the pressures that push women into the abortion clinic are sexist ones and are cruel to pregnant women and their true needs. And this thesis has been expounded ever since the 18th century, but especially in the 19th century by people such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it was clear to them, and for documentation on this, there's a book called ProLife Feminism, Yesterday and Today. Now, that's the dynamics of violence. Now I'm going to get back to integrating the cultures. The point with which I began, if the culture of life is consistent, would it not then automatically favor a culture of peace in all the myriad forms of opposition to violence that entails? I mean, we all know of politicians who will use the term culture of life and don't quite seem to get applying this to situations like war, and I'm sure that examples of individual politicians have popped right up into the heads of most of the people in this room. But there is one example I'd like to bring up of Senator Sam Brownback. You know, he's a conservative Republican from Kansas, hoping to run for president next time, they think. And in U.S. News and World Report in April of 2005, he told Gloria Borger, this is how she quotes him, "If we're trying to establish a culture of life, it's difficult to have the state sponsoring executions." Well, it's high time he noticed that, isn't it? But this insight shows that there is great potential for the concept of the culture of life to educate about peace issues, peace and justice and nonviolence issues in a way that just a straight route might not go. That if we use the culture of life as a tool, it can be a very, very powerful tool. Because the human mind does want to be consistent. There is a lot of psychological study on this point. If there's an inconsistency, then people will go through all kinds of gymnastics to pretend that there isn't an inconsistency, or else they'll make themselves consistent because that lack of consistency is a tension in their minds. And so it would be a very powerful tool that we could use. So one of the major points I'm wanting to establish here is the idea that the culture of life is a tool of education for the culture of peace. For those of us that can use it sincerely, it would be one of the most valuable tools. But there's a flip side to the coin. We have a lot of people in our society who are of tender conscience, are of strong ethical beliefs, and very sensitive to the needs of others, who see the peace movement as being inconsistent in its opposition to violence when they see portions of the peace movement also advocating for ready availability of abortion. And in fact, there have been cases where peace movement people have kicked out pro-lifers from their groups or from their coalitions, which of course is even more affirmatively not only supporting abortion but also saying that there won't be an open-minded discussion even. So from the point of view of some of the people that are active in the pro-life movement, they've said to me, Quakers are pacifists. You're a Quaker, how can they possibly be supporting abortion? What answer do I give them? From their point of view, if problems are not solved but made worse by violence, then how can abortion be excused? If we deplore the use of euphemisms to target the vulnerable for destruction in war, then how can we use euphemisms to target unborn children, terminal, people with disabilities in medical centers? And the argument, of course, is, well, we're supporting the rights of women, but to practically any pro-life activist, they're going to know several women who regarded their abortion as traumatic. So they can't see that as something that makes sense to them. So when large numbers of people claim the identity of peace activists and at the same time defend abortion or even view it positively, there's a perception of inconsistency that interferes with the ability to listen, or to have the sense that the message is a sincere one. So the second major point is that the culture of life is not merely a valuable tool, but is essential to establishing the culture of peace. If we want people who don't yet have a full understanding, like Sam Brownback, to make the rhetoric of the culture of life more consistent by opposing other kinds of violence as well, it follows in the other direction. It goes both ways. Is consistency for those who claim the name of peace advocates any less important than those who claim the label of pro-life, basically, is the main point I'm wanting to ask. So the foundations are exactly the same. The protection of human beings from violence, because all rights rely on the right to not be killed. I mean, the right to vote, the right to reasonable housing, the right to decently priced health care, the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of assembly. All of them assume that you're alive. If you don't have the right to not be killed, the right to dignity is you start with the right to not be killed. Right-wing and left-wing distinctions can be dealt with conflict transformation kind of techniques. There's the listening, there's the finding common interests, and there's treating everyone involved as people. And I've had a lot of experience in finding a lot of people who give very right-wing rhetoric, but once they know I'm pro-life, they'll listen to me. And I've had some very, very productive discussions that way. So if we dispense with the stereotypes and note the common interests, I think that both the culture of peace and the culture of life can get greater progress, and then the human race as a whole gets greater progress because we benefit from both. So that's what I'm going to have to say, and then I'd like to, Scott will go ahead and call on people, and we can discuss.